He told me I was too poor to be his wife while his baby was growing inside me. He packed my bags himself and left them on the porch in the rain. 3 months later, he married someone new and he sent me an invitation. He wanted me to watch him win. He had no idea what I had already become. Before I tell you what happened, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and turn your notifications on because what happened next, nobody saw coming. Not him, not her, not even me. Stay until the end of this because this isn't just a story about a man who left. It's a story about what life gives back to you when you've already lost everything you thought mattered. My name is Simone, and I want to tell you what it feels like to love someone who is ashamed of you. I met Malik when I was 23, working 2 jobs and going to community college at night because nobody in my family had ever finished a 4-year degree, and I wanted to be the first. He was charming back then, the kind of charming that makes you feel like the only person in a crowded room. He talked about big dreams, real estate, business deals, a life bigger than the one we were living. I believed every word because I loved him and because love makes you generous with your trust. For the first few years, we were happy in the way two broke people in love are happy. We ate cheap noodles and called it a candlelit dinner. We danced in our tiny apartment kitchen with no music except the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't need much. I just needed him to look at me the way he used to. But somewhere along the way, Malik started climbing. He got a job at a firm downtown, started wearing suits that cost more than our rent, started talking to people who had degrees from schools I'd never even applied to because I knew I couldn't afford them. And slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice it happening, he started being embarrassed by where he came from, which meant he started being embarrassed by me. I remember the night everything cracked open. We were at a dinner with his coworkers, a fancy restaurant where the menu didn't even list prices, which should have told me everything I needed to know before we walked in. I was 6 months pregnant, tired, swollen feet, and one of his coworkers asked me what I did for work. Before I could even open my mouth, Malik laughed it off and said, "Oh, she's just figuring things out right now." Like I was an unsolved math problem instead of his wife carrying his child. I smiled because that's what you do when you're humiliated in public and you don't want to make a scene. But inside, something quiet and important broke. I want you to understand something. I never once asked Malik for anything beyond what we already had. I never complained about the apartment, the second-hand furniture, the budget grocery trips where I counted coins at checkout. I was proud of what we were building, even when it was small. But somewhere in his mind, small had become shameful, and I had become the proof of where he used to be, not where he was going. A few weeks after that dinner, he came home different, quiet, distracted. I asked him what was wrong, and for days he just said it was work stress. But you know, when you live with someone, you learn the difference between tired and guilty. His silence had a different weight to it. Then one evening, he sat me down at our kitchen table, the same table we used to eat cheap noodles at and laugh until midnight, and he told me he had been seeing someone else. Her name was Bianca. Her family had money, real money, the kind of money that opens doors before you even knock on them. He said she understood his ambitions. He said being with me felt like being stuck. He actually used that word, stuck. Like I was quicksand and not the woman who had stood beside him through every broke month, every late rent payment, every dream he hadn't accomplished yet. I sat there with my hand on my belly, 6 months pregnant, and I asked him what about the baby. He looked at me, and I will never forget the coldness in his eyes when he said, "I'll take care of my responsibilities, but I can't keep pretending I'm happy in a life that looks like this." A life that looks like this, as if I was a poorly decorated room he was tired of living in. That same night he started packing my things, not even waiting until morning. He pulled my clothes out of our closet and folded them, almost gently, like he was trying to convince himself he wasn't being cruel by being neat about it. I stood there crying, begging him to think about what he was doing, begging him to remember who we used to be before money changed what he thought he deserved. He didn't even look up from the suitcase. He just kept folding. He left my bags on the porch. It was raining that night, a cold, miserable rain, and by the time I called my best friend Renee to come get me, my clothes were soaked through the bottom of the suitcase. I remember sitting on the curb outside our building, watching the rain fall on everything I owned, feeling like my whole life had been reduced to wet clothes in a stranger's driveway. Renee didn't ask questions. She just hugged me, helped me load everything into her car, and let me cry the entire drive to her apartment. That night, lying on her couch with my hand on my stomach, feeling my baby move inside me, I made myself a promise. I told myself that no matter how broken I felt in that moment, I would survive this. I didn't know yet how true that promise would become, or how far that survival would carry me. The weeks after Malik left were some of the hardest of my life. I was pregnant, jobless because the pregnancy had already cost me shifts I couldn't afford to lose, and sleeping on my best friend's couch like my entire adult life had been erased overnight. I cried more in those weeks than I think I had cried in my entire life combined. But I also got quiet in a different way, a determined kind of quiet, the kind that comes right before you decide you are done being someone's afterthought. One afternoon, about a month after I'd moved in with Renee, a letter arrived addressed to me. Not an email, not a text, an actual letter, thick cream-colored paper with a law firm's letterhead I had never heard of. My first thought was that it was a scam. People prey on women in hard situations, and I almost threw it straight into the trash. But something made me open it. The letter asked me to come in for a meeting regarding the estate of a man named Theodore Vance. I sat with that name for a long moment, because it sounded familiar in the distant, foggy way childhood memories sometimes feel. I remembered barely, a tall man with kind eyes who visited once when I was maybe 7 years old, who my mother seemed nervous around, who left before dinner and never came back. I hadn't thought about him in 20 years. Renee came with me to that meeting because I was too anxious to go alone. The lawyer, a calm, careful man named Mr. Wells, sat across from us and explained that Theodore Vance was my biological grandfather. My mother, it turned out, had been estranged from her father for most of her adult life, a complicated history of pride and old wounds she had never fully explained to me, not because she didn't trust me, but because the pain of it was something she had buried so deep she didn't know how to dig it back up. Theodore Vance had built an empire over the course of 50 years, an empire worth $15 billion. And in his final years, after losing contact with my mother but never stopping the quiet search for the family he'd lost, he had found out about me. He had been watching from a distance, the lawyer said, never interfering but always making sure that when his time came, everything would go to me. I remember sitting in that office, hand on my belly, feeling like the room was tilting. $15 billion. The number didn't even feel real. It felt like something you hear in a movie, not something that happens to a woman who, 3 weeks earlier, had been sleeping on a couch with wet clothes still drying in a garbage bag because she couldn't afford a real suitcase. I didn't celebrate, I didn't cry tears of joy. I sat there feeling something heavier, something more complicated than happiness. Because all I could think about was how Malik had looked at me like I was worth nothing, how he had called me stuck, how he had packed my bags in the rain because being poor with me felt like a punishment to him. And now, through no effort of his, through nothing he had earned, the woman he threw away had quietly become one of the wealthiest people in the country. I didn't tell anyone outside of Renee and Mr. Wells, not my coworkers, not my old friends, and certainly not Malik. I wasn't ready for the world to know, and honestly, I wasn't ready for myself to know either. I needed time to understand who I was now, separate from who I had been when he left me. Those next months were a strange, quiet transformation. I gave birth to my daughter, a beautiful girl with Malik's eyes and my stubbornness, and I named her after my grandmother, a small, private way of honoring where I came from even as I stepped into a future I never imagined. I learned the business slowly, sitting in boardrooms full of men twice my age who underestimated me at first because of how young I was, how unfamiliar I seemed with their world. But I had spent my whole life learning how to work twice as hard for half the recognition. This was no different, except now the stakes were enormous and the recognition eventually came. I earned the board's trust one decision at a time. I asked questions instead of pretending to know answers I didn't have. I surrounded myself with people who explained things to me honestly instead of trying to confuse me into dependence. Slowly, the same executives who had once looked at me with quiet doubt started looking at me with quiet respect. I became the face of Vance Industries, not because I demanded it, but because I earned it late night after late night, my daughter asleep in the next room while I studied contracts and balance sheets like my life depended on it. In a way, it did. I kept my new life private. No interviews, no social media announcements, nothing that would make headlines easy to find unless you were looking closely at financial publications, the kind Malik never read because he was too busy pretending to belong in rooms he hadn't actually earned his way into. Almost a year after he left me on that porch in the rain, an envelope arrived. Elegant, gold-trimmed, the kind of invitation that costs more than most people's monthly rent. It was a wedding invitation. Malik and Bianca. He had actually sent it to me himself, with a handwritten note tucked inside that said, "No hard feelings, I hope you're doing okay. I think it's important we can still be civil for the sake of our daughter." Civil. As if leaving a pregnant woman in the rain was a disagreement about something trivial, instead of an act that nearly broke me. Renee was furious when she saw it. She told me not to go, said it was a trap dressed up as decency, said he just wanted to see me struggling so he could feel good about his decision. And for a moment, she was right about his intentions, but I didn't decide to go for him. I decided to go for me. I needed to walk into that room and close a door myself on my own terms instead of carrying around an open wound for the rest of my life. The day of the wedding, I dressed simply. No flashy jewelry, no statement dress designed to turn heads. I wore something elegant but understated because I wasn't there to prove anything to anyone with how I looked. I was there to prove something with how I stood. When I walked into that venue, holding my daughter's hand, I felt eyes shift toward me the way eyes do when people sense something is about to happen but don't yet understand what. A few people recognized my face, not from any tabloid but from business articles, panel discussions, an interview I had given quietly to an industry magazine months earlier. I heard whispers start to ripple through the room before Malik even realized I had arrived, people leaning toward each other, mouthing my name, then mouthing the words Vance Industries with raised eyebrows and dropped jaws. By the time Malik saw me, the room had already shifted underneath him without his permission. I watched his face change in real time, confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like fear, the kind of fear that comes from realizing the story you told yourself about someone was completely wrong. Bianca's smile faltered the moment she noticed people whispering instead of watching her. She didn't understand yet, not fully, but she understood enough to feel the temperature in the room change, and brides notice immediately when they are no longer the center of attention on their own wedding day. I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice, didn't deliver some dramatic speech in front of 200 guests. I simply walked up to Malik, my daughter on my hip, and I let him see, really see, who I had become. He stammered out something about being surprised I came, his voice unsteady in a way I had never heard from him before. I told him calmly that I came because our daughter deserved to see her parents handle things with dignity, even when dignity is hard to find. I told him I wasn't there to ruin his day, only to remind him that I had survived the worst thing he ever did to me, and survival had turned into something he never expected. He tried to recover his composure, tried to make a joke about how successful I had apparently become, tried to laugh it off the way he used to laugh off my dreams at fancy dinners years earlier. But his laugh sounded hollow this time. Because everyone around him could see what he refused to admit. The woman he had called stuck, the woman he packed into rain-soaked suitcases, because she wasn't enough for the life he wanted, had built a life so far beyond what he was reaching for that his new marriage. His new money, his new image suddenly looked very small in comparison. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. My calm was louder than anything I could have said. Before I left, I knelt down slightly so my daughter could see her father, and I told Malik that she would always know who he was, but she would also always know who fought for her when he didn't. I told him I forgave him, not because what he did was okay, but because carrying that anger forward would only poison the peace I had worked so hard to build. Forgiveness, I realized somewhere in those months of building my new life, was never really for the person who hurt you. It was for yourself, so the past stops renting space in your future. I walked out of that wedding holding my daughter, climbing into my own car, driving toward my own life under my own name on my own terms. I didn't look back to see his face. I didn't need to. I already knew everything I needed to know about the kind of man who chooses status over love, who values money more than the people who stood beside him before he had any. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have understood in the middle of that pain. Sometimes the people who walk away from us aren't rejecting our worth, they're revealing their inability to see it. Malik didn't leave because I wasn't enough. He left because he was too afraid of staying small with someone who loved him purely, instead of staying connected to someone who could elevate his image. His loss wasn't a reflection of my value, it was a reflection of his limitations. I think about that little girl I used to be, sitting on a curb in the rain with wet suitcases, certain that my life was over, certain that I had lost everything that mattered. I wish I could go back and tell her that the worst night of her life was about to become the beginning of the truest version of herself. I wish I could tell her that worth was never something someone else could take away from her, no matter how convincingly they tried. If you've ever been left by someone who made you feel small, who made you feel like your love wasn't enough simply because your bank account wasn't big enough, I want you to hear me clearly. Your value was never tied to what someone else was willing to recognize. Sometimes life takes everything away just to clear space for something greater to arrive. And sometimes, the very thing someone mocked you for not having becomes the thing that proves exactly how wrong they were about you. If this story touched you, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, would you have walked away the moment he did, or would you have waited it out the way I did? If you believe real strength is quiet, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs to hear tonight that their worth was never tied to someone else's opinion of them. I'll see you in the next story.